This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the fighting in Gaza intensifies. Israel takes out Hamas tunnels and fights off a terrorist incursion, while a Hamas attack scares the international community into cutting off flights to Israel. Plus, accusations of war crimes. The U.S. is investigating Israel's conduct in Gaza. This British general says they should be taking a closer look at Hamas. And blessed are the peacemakers, how churches in Gaza and the West Bank are preaching a message of peace. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you from the Israeli-Gaza border. Israel's ground campaign for Operation Protective Edge just began over a week ago. And right now, Israel is dismantling and destroying a maze of terror tunnels in this region. In the meantime, Hamas has fired over 2,000 missiles into Israel's civilian population. Here's a look back at the week's events. Hamas launched nearly 80 rockets at Israel on the same day the UN passed a resolution to investigate Israel for war crimes.
It puts the whole burden of the situation on Israel when the current crisis began, when Hamas launched rockets at Israeli cities.
Israel came under fire for attacking the Wafa hospital on Tuesday. The IDF released this footage showing how Hamas used the hospital to shoot at Israel, and a transcript of a phone conversation confirming the hospital was empty.
This use of human shields is extraordinarily cynical, it's grotesque, it's inhuman. But what is equally grotesque is that Israel was condemned in the Human Rights Council. It's a travesty of justice.
Israel says it puts its own soldiers at risk by warning Palestinian civilians to leave places it will attack, thereby forfeiting the element of surprise, while Hamas actually uses its own civilians as human shields.
They attempt to lure us to kill their civilian population. It's a common theme among Islamist extremist groups in this world.
Colonel Richard Kemp commanded British ground troops in Afghanistan.
Everything I've seen would suggest to me that Israel is not committing a war crime. Far from it. Israel is going further than most other countries in this world would go to prevent the loss of innocent civilian life. The people that are committing the war crimes are Hamas, who are both firing rockets into the Israeli civilian population indiscriminately and also using their own people as human shields. That is a war crime. Hamas want the Israeli Defense Force to kill their children, their women, their civilians. That's what they want to happen. They want to get the propaganda.
Yet with firepower on its side and footage of devastation on Hamas's side, Israel is often at a disadvantage to present its case. Hamas has launched more than 2,000 rockets at southern Israeli communities. Israel responded by targeting more than 3,000 terror sites in the last 2.5 weeks. One of those rockets crashed into a house close to Ben Gurion Airport earlier this week, prompting American and European airlines to halt flights to and from Israel for more than a day. And then there are the terror tunnels.
And I can't imagine anything more terrifying for the people who live there than the thought that suddenly the earth opens up, almost like a scene out of a grade B zombie movie. And the walking dead come out, except they're not dead, they're not walking, and they're armed with machine guns, anti-tank missiles, grenades, and a few thousand rounds of ammunition. That's why we had to do the ground operation.
Earlier in the week, 10 terrorists snuck out of a tunnel opening inside Israel and killed 4 Israelis before being killed themselves. Israel has uncovered more than 30 terror tunnels, some leading directly to Israel, and they've destroyed 11 of them.
If there is no border with that, if there is no boundary, if there is no limit to their access, then we are completely exposed and there is no line of defense. It's an unbearable reality.
There is plenty of tragedy. A UN school in Gaza was hit by an explosion, killing 15 people, many of them children. Palestinians fleeing the fighting had taken shelter in the school, though the IDF says they were warned to get out. Israel said it was investigating the incident, but it's not clear if it was the result of an Israeli returned fire at Hamas or a Hamas rocket itself. 33 Israeli soldiers were killed during the first week of the ground offensive, and more than 800 Palestinians have been killed, more than 200 of them known terrorists. And at what could become a new front for Israel, thousands of Palestinians rioted as they marched from the West Bank city of Ramallah towards Jerusalem on Thursday evening, protesting Israel's actions in Gaza. 2 Palestinians were killed in clashes with police. The Israeli police sent reinforcements to Jerusalem ahead of the last Friday of Ramadan. Hamas officials called on Palestinians to start a third intifada uprising. They called for a day of rage on Friday. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Secretary of State John Kerry shuttled back and forth in the region, trying to broker a ceasefire.
Stop fighting, start talking, and take on the root causes of the conflict so we are not back to the same situation in another 6 months or a year.
What grievance can we solve for Hamas? Their grievance is that we exist. They don't even want a two-state solution.
In the midst of the fighting, we had exclusive access to a hospital that's on the front lines of the battle. My colleague George Thomas reports from a hospital that treats both Israelis and Palestinians in the Israeli city of Ashkelon.
Dr. Ron LOBEL has worked at BARZILAI Hospital for 34 years. But as deputy director of the hospital, he still cannot get used to the sound of the siren, warning of incoming rockets, which sends everyone scrambling to shelter.
We've been living with this situation of rockets exploding above the hospital, and some of them were exploding within the premises of the hospital.
BARZILAI is just 7 miles from Gaza and within easy reach of Hamas's rockets.
It means that our staff driving back and forth, coming for their shifts, are under threat.
BARZILAI is also one of the main hospitals treating injured Israeli soldiers coming off the battlefield. CBN News was there when medics brought in a soldier severely injured during a firefight with Hamas.
Under normal conditions, when I mean normal, when the war is not going on, this room would be sealed off. There would be no use of it. But today, it's a hive of activity because it houses some of the most vulnerable patients here in the city.
Dr. LOBEL gave CBN News a tour of the hospital, including the underground bunker turned neonatal ward that's caring for premature babies.
This is the most sheltered area in the hospital, the real sheltered area in the hospital. And these are the babies that might suffer most from moving urgently from one place to another.
BARZILAI also treats Palestinian patients from the West Bank. In fact, before the recent conflict erupted, patients from Gaza routinely visited the hospital. But Hamas has stopped that for now. LOBEL has spent many years in Gaza training Palestinian doctors and nurses. Many of them have worked at BARZILAI alongside their Israeli counterparts.
You can see lying side by side a patient from Gaza and a patient from Sderot or from Ashkelon being injured by a Palestinian rocket. And they lie side by side and they are being treated by Israeli doctors and by Palestinian trainees. We always say that we have a box at the entrance where we leave our politics outside, and here whoever knocks on our door is being treated.
LOBEL says the hospital is a symbol of what he hopes will someday bring lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. George Thomas, CBN News, Ashkelon, Israel.
Coming up, as the world community condemns Israel's operations in Gaza, this colonel says Israeli forces are doing more than Hamas to protect Palestinian civilians. Colonel Richard Kemp is an experienced veteran in wartime situations. He was the commander of British forces in Afghanistan. George Thomas spoke with Colonel Kemp about a number of issues, including the similarities of fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan and Hamas in Gaza.
Why is it always the doctrine of proportionality come up when it deals with Israel?
I think people see the effectiveness of Israel's defense systems, of the Iron Dome, of their warning systems and shelter systems, and they see that as a consequence of those measures that Israel's invested a huge amount of money in, that there are very few casualties on the Israeli side. On the contrary, the Hamas-Palestinian side in Gaza, no money's been invested in putting civilians in shelters, and therefore when attacked by Israel, there's a imbalance between the rate of casualties. And people see footage of casualties, and they automatically assume therefore Israel must be committing a war crime and reacting disproportionately, but proportionally war has nothing to do with the balance of casualties between each side.
Is Israel committing a war crime in this offensive?
Everything I've seen would suggest to me that Israel is not committing a war crime. Far from it. Israel is going further than most other countries in this world would go to prevent the loss of innocent civilian life. The people that are committing the war crimes are Hamas, who are both firing rockets into the Israeli civilian population indiscriminately and also using their own people as human shields. That is a war crime.
And this is a pattern that is repeated by other so-called armies around the world, whether it's ISIS, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, the Taliban. Why is this a common mode of operation for these groups?
It's a common theme among Islamist extremist groups in this world. And the reason they do it is because they cannot take us head on. They do not have the ability to fight us and engage us in a face-to-face battle, gun to gun. Whenever they do that, they lose hands down.
The United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, has come out in essence criticizing Israel for its excessive use of force. You say that in essence that Ban Ki-moon is supporting Hamas's use of human shields and in essence is supporting war crimes. Is that correct?
Ban Ki-moon is endorsing Hamas's tactic of using human shields. He is endorsing Hamas's tactics of forcing their civilian population to stay in weapon positions and to be killed by the Israeli Defense Forces, which is what Hamas want. And the Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, is endorsing that tactic by Hamas, as are other commentators, other leaders around the world, who also suggest that Israel is using disproportionate force in dealing with this problem.
Does that give groups like Hamas the green light to continue doing what it does, to continue putting rockets and mortars in a civilian population, in the homes of just ordinary folks?
Hamas's strategy is the dead baby strategy, the strategy whereby they try and lure and force their enemy, in this case Israel, to kill their children. Because people endorse it, it spreads, it's used elsewhere. It's like kidnapping someone and then paying a ransom.
What is Israel's final objective? What's the end game in this operation?
Prevent missiles being fired out of Gaza, to prevent other forms of attack out of Gaza, and then to demilitarize Gaza permanently. But let's not forget, many Israeli soldiers have been killed already. There's got to be a significant return for the sacrifice made by Israeli soldiers in this campaign.
When you look at a non-state army like Hamas, like Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, al-Nusra and so forth, does it make it more complicated when in trying to enforce the rules of law, the Geneva Convention, in dealing with this sort of a situation?
It's very difficult to endorse the law, to maintain the laws of war when you're fighting an enemy that completely disregards the laws of war. In fact, an enemy that exploits the laws of war and your adherence to them against you. So it is difficult, but nevertheless it's important that continues, no matter how hard it is.
Up next, the church steps up. How Christians in the West Bank and Gaza are serving their communities in the midst of war. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. Caught in the crossfire here in Israel is the Christian community. Still, churches in the region are doing what they can to foster peace and serve their communities. George Thomas has this report on one church in the West Bank and another in Gaza that are doing their part to lift up Jesus Christ.
Before the end of Islam's month of Ramadan, police are taking no chances, stepping up security across the country.
We've mobilized a different number of units, and the last Friday of the Ramadan at the moment, our units are on standby.
In what some say were the largest protests in 3 decades, 10,000 Palestinians angry about Israel's offensive in Gaza confronted security forces near Jerusalem. 1 Palestinian was killed and 150 injured. Hamas has called for an uprising. Meanwhile, Israel's operations in Gaza continue, as do Hamas's rocket barrage. Like Muslims in Gaza, Palestinian Christians are also suffering in this war.
We hardly go outside the house. There are missiles and rockets flying everywhere, bombs going off. It's so scary.
In an exclusive phone interview from Gaza City, Ahmed described to CBN News what life's been like since the conflict started.
This situation is very dangerous. We only go out to buy food when there's a pause in the fighting. Even then, we're not sure if a missile will hit or not. However, we thank God none of the believers have been hurt or killed so far.
There are no reliable figures, but estimates put the number of Christians in the Gaza Strip at about 1,500 out of a population of nearly 2 million. Ahmed is a key leader in the evangelical community. Despite the chaos, he says Gazan Christians are quietly encouraging their fellow citizens.
We're sharing scripture verses with our neighbors, telling them Bible stories and using Facebook and text messages to encourage people not to give up. We only have Christ to depend on.
During a brief humanitarian truce this week, some 1,000 Palestinians, almost all of them Muslims, left their homes and sought refuge in one of the only 2 churches in Gaza. Nahid al-Sharfawi's home is in Sajaya, a suburb of Gaza, where Hamas had rockets, tunnels, and command centers. She said she received a recorded message from the Israeli military to evacuate the area to protect their lives.
We were given a warning that our house would be demolished, so we came here to the church and they told us it was safe.
The archbishop of the church says many, like Nahid, lost everything.
They get out from their houses with their clothes, just to carry their children, their babies.
Bishop Alexis has hardly had time to sleep, trying to ensure that his place of worship turned refugee center is meeting needs of the displaced.
First of all, water, to give food to the babies, milk, to give medicines, those who are in need.
Ahmed says the gesture by the Greek Orthodox Church has brought some unity.
Everyone's suffering in this conflict, Christians and Muslims. So when the church opened its doors, people all felt they were together.
During our conversation, Ahmed asked people around the world to pray for the church in Gaza.
There are 4 things you can pray for. We need wisdom on how to share the gospel with those who are broken and have lost everything. Second, pray for our protection. Third, we need endurance and strength to hang on. And fourth, for the Lord to open doors so we can meet the physical needs of people when this war is over.
46 miles away from Israel's offensive against Hamas in Gaza, there's another battle some say is being dangerously ignored by the world.
The West Bank is being neglected, where the riots are being done every single night, almost now 13, 14 nights in a row. Focused on Gaza.
Stephen Khoury, a prominent Christian Arab who lives in Bethlehem, worries the area is ripe for another uprising.
I was born in Jerusalem. I grew up in Bethlehem. I remember how the first and second intifada started, and I'm seeing in this an evidence of a possible another outbreak of an intifada happening in the West Bank.
Here on the streets, Palestinian protesters, angry about Israel's war on Hamas, are running daily skirmishes with Israeli soldiers and Palestinian Authority police. Several people have been killed and injured.
This is a security wall that divides Israel and the West Bank. For nearly 2 weeks, there have been violent protests taking place right here on the street, as well as in other West Bank cities such as Hebron, Nablus, and Ramallah.
Neither Israel nor the Palestinian Authority want to see another front of the war open in the West Bank.
We are delighted to have
Colonel Peter Lerner is Israel Defense Forces spokesman.
We need to try and keep it calm and keep it controlled. It might not be possible.
To avoid further violence, Khoury, who helps lead a prominent church in Bethlehem, is calling on his people to de-escalate the tensions.
In Ecclesiastes it says there's a time to mourn, a time to laugh, and a time to dance. This is a time, I believe, for neither three. This is a time where we need to be people, are peacemakers. We need to be a voice, a balanced, a righteous voice in the midst of a wilderness.
For several weeks now, his church has been distributing copies of the New Testament and bottles of water wrapped with the scripture verse, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God."
We need to preach love, forgiveness, acceptance. We need to preach the message of do not fight, do not be overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good.
In the meantime, the U.S. State Department is warning Americans to avoid travel to Bethlehem and other cities in the West Bank because of ongoing hostilities in the region. George Thomas, CBN News, Bethlehem.
When we return, putting out the fires, the volunteers who came from America to help Israel in its time of need. In the past few weeks, Hamas has fired more than 2,000 rockets into Israel, putting about 5 million Israelis within rocket range. We've heard about the military response, but this onslaught has put a great strain on Israeli firefighters. Now they're getting some help from overseas. During the crisis in Israel, American firemen answered the call from EVP the emergency volunteer project to help Israeli firefighters in the midst of dry and dangerous conditions. The volunteers with EVP come from all over the United States, from New York to California. And they want to come because of the bond between firefighters all over the world and a deep love for Israel.
I've always loved Israel and the Israeli people, and I wanted to come help any way I could. I heard how understaffed they were and how busy they get, so I wanted to come help out my brothers here in Israel.
The program bringing these firefighters together is the Emergency Volunteer Project, or EVP.
It's a non-for-profit in the United States that was established a few years ago with the intention of finding the lovers of Israel, people with a heart for the state of Israel that would be willing to deploy and help in crises and emergencies.
These guys made us feel so welcome. We respect them, they respect us, and honestly, it's like being in a fire station back home. It's just the camaraderie is one of the reasons we come.
The firefighters' bond transcends language, culture, and country.
They do it everything. What we do, they do. So we don't give them any discounts, and they don't give us any discounts. So it's just a part of the team.
They stand ready to deploy at a moment's notice.
Wherever they're the busiest, where their firefighters are being overwhelmed, and right now that area is we're up along the Gaza border is where we're most needed.
EVP's assistance ranges from working with those involved in search and rescue to community service. Whatever the field, Israelis feel a deep appreciation for the volunteers who stand in the gap for Israel.
Having people leaving their families, leaving their jobs in less than 24-hour notice, dropping everything they do, flying miles and miles to a place that is under fire, risking their own life because they believe in something. This is something that I treasure. The EVP has American volunteers, Israeli volunteers, Jewish volunteers, Christian volunteers, and it's all about the bridge. It's all about being together, standing together.
That's it for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. You can follow us on Facebook at Jerusalem Dateline, and also George Thomas reporting. And as a reminder, please pray for the situation here in the region. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.